There are moments in a man's life when he must choose between who he has been and who he will become. The choice is offered in silence, in the space between breaths, in the weight of a loaded rifle held at arm's length. There is no committee of elders to decide. There are no laws written down in leather books by men in distant cities. There is only the man himself, and the truth of his character given naked to the world. The frontier offered such moments with relentless frequency, a place where a man's word was his only currency and his courage his only law. But rarest of all were the moments where a man had to choose whose humanity mattered, whose life held weight against the weight of custom and caution. Those moments separated the living from the merely breathing. Those moments built the frontier. Those moments broke it. This is the story of Garrett Hurst, a horse breeder, age 39, standing alone at the gate of his ranch on a golden October afternoon in New Mexico territory in the year of our Lord, 1882. He had inherited the ranch from his father, a man who had died badly, shot from his horse by raiders when Garrett was only 17. The old man had been hauling supplies back from a settlement called Corazon, riding through land that had been promised to be safe, but never was. The bullets that took him came without warning, and he fell into red earth that drank his blood like it was thirsty. Garrett had found him 3 days later, when the smell led him to the place. The ranch itself was a small mercy in the middle of nowhere. Garrett had built it up over 2 decades with his own hands and the strength of his will. The main adobe house stood a quarter-mile from the main gate, its walls thick enough to stop a bullet, its roof patched and repatched with the labor of seasons. The barn was larger than the house and better maintained. It had to be, because horses were the heart of everything here. In the corrals beyond the barn, nearly 30 head of breeding stock moved through their days in the rhythm of work and care. These were not ordinary animals. These were the product of careful selection, of Garrett knowing bloodlines the way other men knew the faces of their children. A good horse bred true. A horse with strong bones and a calm temperament could be trusted in the hard country. These animals Garrett had selected and bred with a patience that was almost monastic in its devotion. The New Mexico autumn surrounded the ranch like a benediction. The cottonwoods along the wash a mile south had turned gold and orange, their leaves catching the angled light in ways that made the entire landscape seem afire. The air had that particular clarity it held only in October and early November, when the brutal heat of summer had released its grip and the cold of winter had not yet arrived. The pinon smoke from the settlement at Corazon rose in pale columns from chimneys 2 miles away, enough distance to suggest another world entirely. The mountains in the east caught the long light of afternoon and held it on their ridges, their slopes shifting through shades of red and purple and deep shadow. This was land that could kill you or feed you, depending entirely on whether you had learned to listen to what it was trying to tell you. Garrett had learned. He had built his life around that learning. From that day forward, Garrett Hurst had learned one absolute truth. The world punished weakness and rewarded only those who were willing to stand alone. He had built the ranch from nothing, breaking wild horses with patience and skill that came from understanding that a horse, like a man, was driven more by caution than by nature. You could not force either one. You could only know them deeply enough to speak a language they understood. He had made the ranch work, had made it prosper, had made himself into something other people respected, not because he was cruel, but because he was incapable of backing away from a stand once he had taken it. That reputation, earned over 22 years of solitude and work, had kept most trouble at a distance. But not all trouble, and not the kind that came on a dark night in October. The boy had appeared at the ranch gate near midnight, bleeding and riding a horse that did not belong to him. The animal was a pale roan, well-bred and clearly stolen, its eyes rolling with panic at the gunfire that had driven it north. The boy was 12 years old, lean and tall for his age, with an arrow wound through his left forearm that had begun to blacken at the edges. He wore a buckskin vest over a bare chest and cloth leggings, and his long black hair was tied back with a piece of rawhide. His eyes were dark and sharp, watchful, not broken, just observing, assessing, waiting to see what this stranger would do. Garrett had not asked questions. This was frontier logic. A young boy, an arrow wound, a stolen horse meant that someone somewhere wanted him badly enough to bleed for it. The why of it was less important than the fact of it. Garrett helped him down from the saddle and half carried him into the barn, the boy's weight light and trembling against his shoulder. The barn smelled of hay and horse and the particular scent of things that had been alive and kept alive for a long time. Garrett laid the boy down on a clean canvas and brought water heated over the fire, boiling clean and clear, along with whiskey that burned like it was made from pain itself. The arrow had gone entirely through the muscle and gristle of the forearm, punching in from the outside and coming out the other side with violence that suggested either a strong bow or a very close shot. The edges had already begun to blacken with the early signs of infection, the flesh around the wound showing the heat of gathering sickness. Garrett had seen men die from infections like this. He had also seen men live through worse. He cleaned the wound with methodical care, pouring water to flush out the debris of bone and cloth and tissue. The boy made no sound through any of it. His teeth were clenched, his eyes fixed on the barn roof above him, but his body did not struggle. He understood, perhaps from generations of teaching, that screaming did not change the outcome of necessity. Garrett bound the wound with clean cloth torn from an old shirt, wrapped the bandage tight enough to stop the bleeding, but not so tight as to cut off the circulation entirely. He fashioned a sling from leather cord to keep the arm immobilized against the boy's body, supporting the weight so that movement would not tear open what had only just begun to close. He gave the boy water to drink, clean and cool from the well, and a place to sleep in the barn, in the hay, where it was warm and dry. That first night, Garrett sat up in the barn with a rifle across his lap, watching, waiting to see if fever would come. It did on the second night, spiking so high that the boy's eyes went glassy and his words came out in a language Garrett could not understand. For 2 days and nights, Garrett came out to check on him every few hours, to monitor the fever, to change the bandages twice daily, checking for the signs of infection that would have meant amputation or death, to bring food, broth mostly, because eating was hard when your body was fighting something it could not see. On the 4th day, the fever broke. The boy's eyes cleared. The blackness at the edges of the wound began to recede. Garrett knew then that the boy would live. It was the horse that brought the trouble. That pale roan was known throughout the territory as belonging to Cade Harmon, a man who had built a modest empire on stolen goods and borrowed violence. Harmon was not the worst of the outlaw men. He was not a murderer by design, only by necessity and opportunity. But he was the kind of man who could not afford to let a theft go unpunished, because the moment word spread that Cade Harmon had been stolen from, he would cease to exist as a power in the territory. And so, when that pale roan disappeared from his camp 30 miles south, Harmon had saddled up with 3 men, a stringy thing named Cole Pratt with a scar across his jaw, a broad-chested fellow named Rusk who had killed at least 2 men that anyone could prove, and a younger boy barely 20 who looked like he had never seen the inside of a smile. They arrived at Garrett's gate on a dust-red afternoon when the cottonwoods were burning gold and the light was long enough to throw shadows that swallowed everything. Garrett had been breaking a young Mustang when he heard the hoofbeats, 4 riders coming up the southern trail at a pace that was not casual. He had finished his work with the Mustang, put the animal in the enclosure, and walked out to the gate with his rifle held at his side, not pointed, but present. The message was clear. I am not hiding. I am not afraid. Harmon rode forward until his horse was 10 feet from the gate, then stopped. He was a man in his mid-50s, with the kind of weathered face that suggested he had spent a lifetime outdoors and none of it in peace. His hair was gray at the temples, and he wore his reputation the way other men wore suits, with an understanding that it preceded him and shaped how people moved in his presence. "You got a horse," Harmon said. It was not a question. "I got several," Garrett said. "That's how you know a working ranch. A pale roan, well-bred, mine." The silence that followed was long enough to count, long enough to feel the weight of it. "Also got the boy," Harmon said. "Apache, stole my horse. Shot by his own people, far as I can see from that arm. Probably worth a bounty in the settlements. Or dead and worth nothing. Your choice." Garrett said, "Boy stays." The 3 men behind Harmon shifted, a subtle movement, but present. Rusk was grinning. The younger boy looked confused, like a dog that had been asked to do something it did not understand. "Your choice about the horse is the same as the boy," Harmon said. "You got a decision to make." Garrett had not moved, had not changed his expression. The rifle was still at his side, loaded and ready, but not threatening. "I'm keeping both," Garrett said. "You're welcome to turn around and ride back south." The smile that crossed Harmon's face was the kind that had no warmth in it, the kind that men wear when they are moving into violence and want you to know it. He raised his hand, and the 3 men began to spread out, moving so they could cover more ground if the shooting started. Rusk's hand was near his pistol. The young boy looked like he wanted to run. Cole Pratt was watching Garrett with the focus of a man who had practiced this dance before. But the shooting did not start. Instead, a woman's voice cut through the growing darkness like a blade. "You can turn around now, Mr. Harmon, or you can wait to see if you're still fast enough." It was Miriam Braddock, Garrett's nearest neighbor, standing at the fence line with a rifle held like she knew what to do with it. She was a widow in her middle years, with red-touched hair and eyes that had seen enough loss to understand what losing more would mean. She had brought bandages and food the night the boy arrived, moving through her own caution to do what her conscience required, and she had apparently decided that Garrett Hurst did not get to stand alone at this particular gate. Harmon was no fool. He could handle Garrett possibly. He could handle Miriam possibly. He could not handle both, not without losing at least 1 man to bullets, and possibly 2. And he was not the kind of man who died for principle. He was the kind of man who died for failure to plan well enough. "This ain't over," Harmon said. The words were directed at Garrett, but meant for all of them. "It is," Garrett said. "You're leaving now, and you're not coming back." Harmon wheeled his horse and rode away, the 3 men following. Within an hour, they had disappeared south into the gathering darkness, back toward whatever camp they called their own. The sun went down red as blood over the western mountains. The air cooled fast, the way it does in autumn in that country. Pinon smoke began to rise from the settlement's chimneys 2 miles distant, smoke and wood smell and the memory of warmth. Garrett was alone with Miriam and the boy, and with the knowledge that his simple act of protection had just changed something fundamental in how the territory saw him. Cade Harmon would not forget. He would not forgive. And while the threat had passed, the cost was still being calculated somewhere in the darkness. The boy watched all of this from the barn door, understanding perfectly that something had shifted, though perhaps not yet understanding what it meant. After Harmon and his men had ridden away, the boy had emerged into the courtyard. Miriam had come over and spent an hour showing Garrett how to properly care for the wound, when to change the bandages, what herbs to use, what signs of infection to watch for. She brought supplies from her own ranch. She brought food. She stayed for supper and discussed the territory and politics with the ease of someone who had learned to read the land the way others read books. But after she left, Garrett found himself alone with the boy in a way that felt different now. The immediate crisis had passed. Now there was time. Time to discover what kind of person the boy was beyond his need for rescue. The boy remained mostly silent, but silence was a language Garrett understood. He had spoken it for 22 years. On the second day after Harmon's departure, Garrett brought the boy into the corrals to help with the work. The boy's arm was still immobilized, still healing, but there were tasks that could be done one-handed. The boy proved to have an understanding of horses that went beyond his years. When Garrett worked with a difficult mare, a young animal that had never accepted human touch without rearing, the boy approached the animal with patience, speaking in soft words in a language Garrett could not understand, but whose meaning was unmistakable. The mare gradually calmed. The boy was able to run a hand down the animal's neck without the animal flinching. Garrett recognized what he was seeing: genuine skill, not luck, not accident, the understanding of bloodlines and temperament that only came from a people for whom breeding excellence was as ancient as memory. That night, Garrett found himself alone in his ranch house with the weight of the decision he had made pressing down on him. He sat with a bottle of whiskey and thought about his father, thought about the day he had found his father's body, 3 days dead in the red earth, the smell calling the vultures, thought about the choice his father had made, or failed to make, on that day. His father had been hauling supplies. His father had been a peaceful man. His father had not had a rifle close enough when the raiders came. Or perhaps his father had simply understood that sometimes standing against violence was futile and had chosen not to fight. Garrett would never know. But his father had died, and in dying, he had taught Garrett that the world did not respect mercy. The world respected will. The world respected the ability to hold a line. But what Garrett had done at the gate was different. He had not held a line for himself. He had held it for someone else, for a boy, for a culture that was being erased by the expansion of settlement and law and progress. What would his father have done? Garrett realized, with a clarity that came from the whiskey and the solitude and the weight of consequence, that his father would have done exactly what Garrett had done. His father had died because he was not willing to fight back. Garrett had lived because he was willing to. The boy sleeping in the barn was alive because Garrett understood something his father had not, that some things were worth standing for, even when the cost was everything. 3 days passed. The boy's wound began to heal, the blackness at the edges fading, as Garrett kept it clean and packed it with herbs that Miriam brought. The boy ate well and spoke not a single word, though sometimes Garrett would catch him looking north, in the direction of the mountains, with an expression of such longing that it seemed to cause him physical pain. At night, Garrett would sit in the barn and watch the boy sleep, and he would think about what awaited the boy in the mountains. Tribe, family, a world that Garrett could not truly comprehend, but could at least honor by keeping the boy safe until that world came to claim him. On the third morning before dawn, a sound like rolling thunder came from the southern trail. Garrett woke in his ranch house and knew immediately what it was. Not Harmon returning, something else entirely. He armed himself and walked out into the pre-dawn darkness, where the stars were burning bright and hard against a sky that seemed infinite. The sound grew closer, became the distinct sound of many horses moving at a controlled pace. Not a charge, a procession. When they emerged from the darkness, they came like ghosts taking shape in the golden light of dawn breaking over the eastern horizon. 37 mounted figures moving in careful order, their horses stepping with the deliberate pace of animals that understood what they carried. These were hunting horses and war horses, animals bred in the canyons and mountains for the work of moving across hard country. Hunters on horses bred for the work. Warriors, Garrett understood, but moving with purpose and precision, not malice. The lead rider was an old man, perhaps 70 winters old, with a face that had been scarred by sun and time and violence and experience. His eyes held the quality of a man who had watched empires crumble and watched his own people endure through the crumbling. Behind him, younger riders, warriors in the fullness of their strength, their backs straight, their posture showing the confidence of men who understood what they were and what they could do. Behind them, the body of the tribe's mounted force, animals and men moving as a single organism unified by purpose and blood. The old man raised his hand, and the riders stopped at the gate. 37 horses and 37 riders standing in the golden light of dawn. The boy had emerged from the barn at the sound of hoofbeats, and now stood in the doorway, his bandaged arm still immobilized, his face showing the recognition of something his body had been longing for. For a moment, perhaps a full 10 seconds, perhaps a lifetime, nothing moved. The only sound was the settling of horses and the wind pushing dust across the dry ground. The town 2 miles away was just beginning to wake to dawn light. The mountains held the sun in their peaks, pushing back the darkness degree by degree. Then the old man spoke in Spanish, since no other language was common to all of them. "You kept my grandson." Garrett understood Spanish well enough. He answered in kind. "The boy came here bleeding. I gave him shelter. 4 men came to take him. 4 men left disappointed." The old man nodded, as if this confirmed something he had already suspected. He dismounted, moving with the careful precision of a man whose joints had seen too many winters and too many fights. He was tall, 6'2" at least, perhaps more, and he moved like he still had the power of 20 in his body, even if the years had started to collect on his bones. He walked toward the boy who stood in the barn doorway. The boy did not move, did not flinch. The old man looked at the bandaged arm, the healed wound, the lack of fever in the eyes. Then he turned to Garrett and said in Spanish, "He will remember this. Your name will be known to our people. This kindness will be remembered the way debts are remembered." "I didn't do it for that," Garrett said. "No," the old man said. "That is why we are here." He turned and gave an order, short, clipped, in a language Garrett did not speak. 2 riders moved forward, leading 8 horses. Not ordinary horses. These were animals that had been bred for generations in the mountains and canyons of Apache country. Each one had been selected with care that suggested the selection process had taken years. The first horse was a deep chestnut with a black mane, his coat showing the shine that came only from careful feeding and work. The second was a silver-dappled gray, his lines showing the breeding that went back generations. The third was a black with white markings, a young animal, but with the bearing of excellence already visible. The others followed, each one a different color, but each one unmistakably the product of careful breeding. These were animals with bloodlines that had been guarded and selected with the care of a man who understood that breeding for excellence was the same as creating a future. They were not just beautiful, they were functional. They were the product of centuries of knowledge about what made a horse strong and reliable in hard country. They stood in a line as the sun broke fully over the horizon, their handlers holding them with gentle hands, their eyes showing the awareness that these were important animals being offered up in a ritual that carried weight. 8 extraordinary horses, a gift, a payment, an acknowledgement, the equivalent, Garrett would later understand, of a year's wages for a working man. More than that, a commitment, a partnership forged in the space between cultures and sealed in blood and honor and the specific language of horses. The old man spoke once more. "This place is neutral ground now. If an Apache comes to trade horses, he comes here. If a settler comes to buy, he comes here. No guns, no violence, only trade. The boy will come each spring when the foaling season comes. He will help you with the work. He will remember you as the man who held the line when the line mattered." Garrett, who had lived alone for 22 years and had grown accustomed to solitude the way a man grows accustomed to a chronic pain, found his eyes were wet. He said nothing. There was nothing to say. The old man turned back to the boy and spoke in their own language. The boy nodded, then approached Garrett with a dignity that seemed impossible in a 12-year-old. The boy held out his hand, and Garrett shook it. The grip was strong and deliberate. The grip of someone who understood that they were sealing something that could not be unsealed. The old man turned his horse and rode away, the tribe following. Within 20 minutes, they had disappeared back into the canyons, leaving behind only the 8 horses and the 8 questions that Garrett would spend the rest of his life trying to answer. By spring, the news had spread through the territory like water finding its way downhill. There was a place where you could trade fairly with Apache, where a man's word meant something, where the blood had stopped flowing long enough for business to happen. By the summer of that year, 5 settlers had ridden to Garrett's ranch and negotiated for breeding stock. By autumn, 2 Apache traders had appeared with leather-sewn goods and crafted items of extraordinary beauty, trading for the horses that Garrett had bred and raised with that fierce patience that was his only language. Subscribe to Western Hearts and Honor so you never miss the next story. There are more like this one waiting. The town's opinion, which had been harsh and dismissive after the outlaw confrontation, began to shift. It shifted the way moss shifts on a stone, slowly, and only when the water had been running in one direction long enough to wear grooves in the rock. Men who had thought Garrett a fool for protecting an Apache boy began to understand that perhaps he had seen something they had not. Perhaps he had understood the opportunity where they had seen only threat. Perhaps the measure of a man was not how well he followed the law, but how well he understood which laws were worth following, and which laws had been written by caution. Cade Harmon did not return to that gate. Word was that he had moved his operations east, into country where the rules were still written entirely by violence, and where a man's conscience was not yet an encumbrance. He had lost prestige by backing away from Garrett Hurst, and in the world of men like Harmon, a single loss of prestige was the beginning of a man's end. By 1885, Harmon was a story that old-timers told in bar rooms. The man who had once tried to take something from Garrett Hurst and had lived just long enough to understand what he had lost by trying. Each spring for the next 12 years, the Apache boy returned to help with the foaling season. His name was Dakota. He was patient and knowledgeable, and he brought the kind of understanding of bloodlines that could only come from a people for whom breeding excellence was as old as memory. The two of them, the middle-aged white man and the Apache boy who became a young man and then a man himself, built something together that transcended the boundaries that had been drawn in blood by previous generations. Garrett lived to be 73 years old, which was a remarkable age for a man who had spent his life doing hard work in harsh country. When he died peacefully in his own bed, with Dakota sitting beside him. And when the word went out that Garrett Hurst was dead, it was the Apache people who came first to mourn, riding across territory that had once been a borderland of blood and death, riding openly and without hesitation. The moment had passed, the moment when Garrett had stood between 4 outlaws and a wounded boy. But the consequences of that moment had rippled outward like water circles from a stone dropped in a still pond. And those circles had not yet finished moving, even 140 years later, in a time when the frontier was nothing but memory, and the horses that Garrett Hurst had bred were still carrying those careful bloodlines into futures he would never see. If this story stayed with you, leave your like, subscribe to Western Hearts and Honor, and tell us in the comments, would you have made the same choice? The Old West was full of moments like this one, moments where an ordinary person had to decide who they actually were when it mattered. We'll be back with more of those stories, the ones the history books almost forgot to keep.